So Alberta just promised to keep BC in the loop on their pipeline plans, and honestly, that's like your roommate promising to tell you before they throw a party after already sending out the invitations. Better late than never, I guess? Welcome back to Canadian Insights, where we cover the provincial drama that makes your family dinners look peaceful. Today we're talking about Alberta and BC trying to patch things up after what can only be described as the most Canadian passive-aggressive political standoff since, well, last month. Premier David Eby just sat down with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney in Ottawa, and apparently they've decided that communication might actually be a good idea when you're planning to build major infrastructure through someone else's backyard. Revolutionary concept, right? This whole situation is like watching two neighbors argue about a fence, except the fence is a massive oil pipeline. One neighbor is obsessed with building it, the other neighbor has environmental commitments and First Nations agreements to honor, and they are both yelling at the landlord, who is the federal government, to pick a side. And somehow we're all supposed to pretend this is going to end well. Here's what went down. Provincial and territorial leaders descended on Ottawa for 2 days of meetings, which is basically like a family reunion except everyone's fighting about jurisdiction and transfer payments instead of who makes the best butter tarts. During these meetings, Eby managed to get Smith to commit to keeping BC updated on Alberta's pipeline proposal progress. Now, before we all start singing Kumbaya, let's remember that this promise comes after Alberta and Ottawa already announced an agreement on a new pipeline back in late November that was negotiated largely without BC at the table. It's like planning a wedding and forgetting to invite the person who owns the venue. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Smith, to her credit, acknowledged before the meeting that the two provinces don't always agree on everything, which is the political equivalent of saying the Titanic had a minor leak. But she also emphasized they have common ground, and she's not wrong. Both provinces care about their economies, both have strong regional identities, and both would really appreciate it if Ottawa would just let them do their thing without so much interference. The problem is their definitions of doing their thing are about as compatible as oil and water, which is ironically what this whole debate is about. Let's talk about why this relationship has become more strained than your jeans after the holidays. Smith has been pushing hard for a new pipeline to the West Coast, and she's been equally vocal about wanting the federal government to repeal the oil tanker ban on BC's North Coast. From Alberta's perspective, this makes perfect sense. They've got oil and gas to sell, they need to get it to global markets, and pipelines are the most efficient way to transport it. It's basic economics, and Alberta's entire economy has been built on energy exports for generations. They look at that tanker ban like someone put a lock on their front door and they can't get to work. But here's where BC's perspective comes in, and it's dramatically different. Eby has been highly critical of new pipeline projects, not because he hates Alberta or wants to see their economy fail, but because BC has different priorities and different commitments. The province has aggressive climate targets, a green economy agenda, and most importantly, relationships with coastal First Nations who have made it crystal clear that repealing the oil tanker ban is a non-negotiable red line. We're not talking about minor objections here, we're talking about fundamental opposition rooted in environmental protection, cultural preservation, and indigenous sovereignty. So you've got Alberta saying we need this pipeline for our economic survival, and BC saying we can't support this pipeline because of our environmental commitments and First Nations partnerships. It's an impasse that makes the Gordian knot look easy to untangle. And stuck in the middle is the federal government, trying to balance Western economic interests with climate commitments and reconciliation promises, which is about as easy as juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle. The tensions between these two provinces aren't new, but they definitely came to a head in late November. That's when Alberta and Ottawa announced they'd reached an agreement on a new pipeline proposal, and BC found out about it basically the same way you find out your ex is dating someone new, through social media and awkward third-party conversations. The deal was done, the announcement was made, and BC was left standing there like, excuse me, doesn't this pipeline cross our province? Don't we get a say in this? It was a massive diplomatic fumble, and it highlighted a fundamental problem in how these megaprojects get negotiated in Canada. You can't just exclude a province from conversations about infrastructure that directly impacts their territory and expect them to be cool with it later. That's not how federalism works, that's not how respect works, and that's definitely not how you maintain good interprovincial relationships. But that's exactly what happened, and it lit a fire under BC-Alberta relations that's still burning. Now we're at this point where Smith is promising to keep BC in the loop, and Alberta is set to submit an application to the Federal Major Projects Office to fast-track a pipeline by next July. Fast-track being the key word here, because Alberta wants this done quickly. They've been watching their energy sector struggle with transportation bottlenecks for years, They've seen billions of dollars in potential revenue lost because they can't get their product to market efficiently, and they're done waiting. From their perspective, they've been patient enough, they've jumped through enough hoops, and it's time to build. But fast-tracking raises all sorts of alarm bells for environmental groups and First Nations communities. Fast-tracking often means cutting corners on consultation, rushing through environmental assessments, and prioritizing economic concerns over ecological and cultural ones. It's efficiency versus thoroughness, and depending on which side you're on, it's either finally getting things done or recklessly ignoring important concerns. This is where the Federal Major Projects Office comes into play. This office was created specifically to streamline the approval process for major infrastructure projects, which sounds great in theory but in practice has been controversial. Critics argue it gives too much power to the federal government and doesn't adequately protect provincial jurisdiction or Indigenous rights. Supporters say it's necessary to get important projects built in a reasonable timeframe instead of drowning in endless bureaucracy. Both sides have valid points, which is why this is such a mess. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about what this all means for Canadian unity, because this isn't just about one pipeline. This is about how we function as a federation when provinces have fundamentally different priorities and values. Alberta's economy is still heavily dependent on oil and gas. That's their reality, and telling them to just transition to a green economy overnight is like telling someone to stop being tall. It's not that simple, it takes time, it takes investment, and it requires serious economic restructuring. Meanwhile, BC has made commitments to First Nations, to climate action, to a different economic vision, and they can't just abandon those commitments because Alberta needs a pipeline. Both provinces are operating rationally within their own contexts, but those contexts are increasingly incompatible. And that's the real problem Canada is facing right now. How do we hold together a country where different regions have such divergent economic models and values? The fact that Smith and Eby sat down together with Prime Minister Carney is actually a positive development, even if it feels like too little too late. At least they're talking. At least there's an acknowledgement that communication needs to happen. But talking is just the first step. The real question is whether they can find any actual compromise that satisfies Alberta's economic needs, BC's environmental commitments, and First Nations rights and concerns. That's a Venn diagram where the overlapping section might be microscopically small. And let's be real about Prime Minister Carney's role in all this. He's walking into a situation that has been building for years, inheriting tensions from previous governments and previous failed projects. He needs Alberta's support politically, he needs to maintain relationships with BC and First Nations, and he needs to demonstrate that his government can actually get big projects done while also meeting climate commitments. It's a political tightrope walk over a pit of alligators, and everyone's watching to see if he falls. The promise to keep BC in the loop sounds simple, but it's actually loaded with implications. Does it mean BC gets veto power? Does it mean consultation but not consent? Does it mean genuine partnership or just regular email updates? The devil is always in the details, and we haven't seen those details yet. It's entirely possible that Alberta thinks keeping BC in the loop means sending them progress reports, while BC thinks it means having actual decision-making power over what happens in their province. This is also happening against the backdrop of broader national conversations about energy transition, climate change, Indigenous reconciliation, and regional fairness. Alberta feels like they're being asked to sacrifice their economy for national climate goals while other provinces get to maintain their industries. BC feels like they're being pressured to compromise their environmental standards and Indigenous relationships for Alberta's economic benefit. Both grievances are real, both are deeply felt, and neither is going away anytime soon. What makes this particularly tricky is that there's no obvious villain here. Smith isn't some cartoon bad guy twirling her mustache and plotting environmental destruction. She's trying to protect Alberta's economy and the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of people. Eby isn't some radical environmentalist trying to destroy the energy sector. He's trying to honor commitments his province has made and protect Indigenous rights and coastal ecosystems. They're both doing what they think is right for their provinces, which is literally their job, but their jobs are putting them in direct conflict. So where does this leave us? Well, with a promise of communication, which is something, but not much. Alberta is moving forward with their application to fast-track the pipeline. BC remains opposed to new pipeline projects and firmly committed to the oil tanker ban. First Nations are watching closely and ready to fight if their rights and territories aren't respected. The federal government is trying to thread an impossible needle. And the rest of Canada is watching this interprovincial drama unfold like it's the most boring season of reality TV ever, except the stakes are actually our national economy and unity. Here's the thing though, You need to be paying attention to this stuff because it affects all of us. Energy policy impacts gas prices, heating costs, the economy, jobs, and climate outcomes. How we handle Indigenous consultation affects reconciliation and the rule of law. How provinces work together or don't determines whether federalism actually functions. This isn't some abstract political theory, this is real policy with real consequences for real people across the country. So if you want to stay on top of how this pipeline saga develops, because trust me it's going to keep developing, you need to subscribe to Canadian Insights. We're covering this story and every other piece of political drama unfolding across Canada, and we're doing it multiple times a day because Canadian politics never sleeps. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you catch every update, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Alberta and BC can actually find common ground? Should the federal government force a decision? Where do First Nations rights fit into all this? I want to hear what you think because this conversation is happening whether we like it or not. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really going on between these provinces, because the mainstream media loves to oversimplify this stuff and you deserve the full picture. Thanks for watching Canadian Insights, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll continue breaking down the political chaos that makes this country simultaneously fascinating and frustrating. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, in Canadian politics, a promise to communicate is progress, even if it shouldn't have to be.